The goal of this demonstration is to show how you can use Link to create a connector that will get Excel data from Google Drive. So these are Excel files stored in Google Drive. Bring those files down and transform them into JSON, and then expose all of this as a readily consumable connector. The first step is to go to your workspace and then create a service which will access the Google Drive API. So I go to the Services tab and click on Create New Service, give it a name and the base URL. Next is to select the authentication type. I want to use OAuth 2. I don't have an existing token, so I want to generate one. So I've skipped ahead a little bit here and entered all of the necessary values for URLs and client ID and client secret and so on. As you see, the scope is set to Auth Drive, which means it will grant me access to the Drive API. The access token and refresh token are blank. These get populated by going through the OAuth 2 authentication sequence. When I click on Authorize, it opens a new tab, asks me to pick my account. And once this is complete, I can close this tab and come back here, and now you see that the access token and the refresh token have been populated. Having created the service, I now want to define endpoints for it. I've defined 5 endpoints here, 3 of which are relevant to this particular use case. The first one is to search for a file by name. So let's take a look at this. In the request, you see the API is files, do a get on files, and I'm specifying a query parameter, which is Q, where the name is a parameter, and you can see the parameter is defined here. And I've put a default value in here. I can actually call the API directly from here. The call was successful, and if I look at the success response, you'll see there's the information I need. What I'm after here is this ID. So I can click on Select from Response, select ID, and specify this as an output parameter. So that means that when this API is called, the result of the API will be returned in this output parameter called ID, and it's going to get it from the body. Now that I have an ID, I can get the content of the file. That's done with the get on the files API again, this time with ID specified in the path, and I need to specify alt equals media to get the content of the file rather than the file metadata. I've specified the ID of a file that I know exists in my Google Drive. So let me click Call API to invoke that. And you can see that was successful, and it returned some binary stuff, which is the Excel data. So that's all working good. Now what I want to do is combine these two calls. I want to be able to provide a file name, get the ID of that file name, and then get the content for that file by ID. So that's where a composite endpoint comes in. I've given a description to say what this API does, and all I need to do is select for the 2 APIs that I want to call. So first of all, I want to call search for file, and then I want to call get file content. I can click validate. It says successful. This is telling me that the outputs from search for file, which is that ID output parameter, matches an input parameter of the second endpoint. So the value that's returned from search for file is then passed to the input of get file content. The next step is to use that service definition in a flow. So I've created a project, and I have just one flow called get Excel. It has 3 nodes in it. The first node invokes my Google Drive service, specifying the composite endpoint download file by name. I'm specifying the file name as a flow variable. So this is going to return raw Excel data down this stream. To be able to process that Excel data, I need to use the Excel adapter. So that's what this request stage is doing. If I look at the settings here, so we go to the operation, it says I'm going to parse that worksheet data, and I'm going to return the first worksheet. And the Excel adapter returns data in a delimited form. I want the result in JSON, so I add one final stage to JSON. So this is saying that the input format is delimited, and here's some specification for that delimited format. It has a pipe delimiter. Each row is terminated by a carriage return line feed. It has a header. This is saying that the first row has header data, and then the output format is JSON. So now let's just try and run this from here. For the file name, I'm specifying the people spreadsheet. When I click run, it completed with success. Now if I look at the output, click view data, there's my response data that came from that Excel file stored in Google Drive. And the final step in creating the flow is to set the schema on the output so that the calling application knows what the returning data is going to look like. So for this, I defined a flow terminal property. You can cut and paste the data that's returned when you run the flow directly into here in the example data, or alternatively you could import it and create a schema. So now I have a flow in a project that is providing the functionality I need to get that Excel data and return it in a JSON form. To make this easily consumable by other applications such as Domino Vault, I want to provide this functionality as a connector. So I click on my connectors tab, create a new connector. I want to create a connector from a project. So I select this option, I select a project. There's the project I just created. Now when I click next, it will default to this ID in this connector. I can pick a nice icon if I want. Now when I hit next, it will look at the flows and see what flow variables I've defined and pull in the values of those and create that as a property. So this connector is going to have a source property, which is the file name. Now if I click next, this will show the list of operations. So operations correspond to flows. In this particular case, there was a single flow in that project, but you could have any number of flows and then any number of operations. And when it gets packaged as a connector, all of those operations would be exposed. I click next and save, and there's my connector. It says it was created successfully. Now I could test my connector. So the first thing to do is to come here and click deploy. So deploy my connector to this server. I can also select additional runtime servers as well. It says it's deployed successfully. Now to test the connector, I can click the test button directly from here. This will launch a new window. By default, it's going to use the test app application. What I want to do is actually test this in the context of Vault, which allows for different connection types and has different settings configured for it. So I'm going to change the path to Vault. Okay, so now I'm going to create a new connection. Let's call it Excel test. I'm going to click next. You can see here's the connector I created, Excel from Google Drive. So I'm going to select this and save it. There were no connection properties in this case. Now I can define an action for this connector. So let's call it get Excel. Select an operation, so there's only one, which was that one flow I defined. Specify the file name, Excel spreadsheet. Click next. In the context of Vault, I need a schema. Vault needs to know what the metadata coming back looks like. So I click generate. In this case, it's actually going to get that metadata from the flow terminal in the flow I defined. And now I click save, and that action will be deployed to the runtime. It just takes a couple of seconds to deploy. Once the action's been deployed, it shows up in the Swagger on the HIP runtime. Here you can see under the connector's name, any actions that are deployed for that connector. And if we take a look at one of these, you'll see that it has the metadata, the data definition of the data that's going to be returned, and there's a corresponding model. So this information is used by Vault when it performs the mapping from the response. So let's see this in action. If I hit execute, it should run. So it's going to run the flow. There's the results. So let's recap what that did. It called two APIs in Google Drive. The first one took a file name as a query parameter that got baked into the action when I configured the action and saved it. The result of that returned an ID, which is then passed to a second API that gets the Excel data in the raw form. That's then passed to the Excel adapter, which understands that raw form and converts it to a delimited form. And then finally, we convert from that delimited form to JSON. Thank you.